All right, guys, so what I'm going to be doing is going through the third part of the study guide, which is focused exclusively on how to do this paper, I'm looking for in this paper, how this paper should be written. We're going to do this by looking at the rubric and talking about the rubric, not in the order of how the paper is actually written, but the order in which you should start your brainstorming. When you get the paper, the first thing you're going to want to do is go through all the documents and do a little bit of brainstorming so you have a good idea or a good outline of how to write this paper before actually writing it. It makes the paper much easier. Now you'll want to go through this very quickly because you're not going to have a ton of time. I would say the first 8 minutes to 10 minutes of the paper should just be brainstorming. And then the last 70 to 80 minutes should be writing the actual paper. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get all your document summaries down. So we're going to practice that. Document summaries are worth 2 points on the paper. You get 3 points, you get 1 point if you have 3 documents, and you get 2 points if you have 6 documents in the summary. So this means that you don't get any points if you just have 1 or 2 documents, so you need a minimum of 3. I would do 4 as a minimum, just in case you don't actually have one of the documents correct. And then for the second point, you don't get any additional points for 4 or 5, but you would for 6. So again, just to recap before we practice, you need to first start your outline with getting all the main points, summaries, and then you need to have at least 3 documents to get 1 point. So if we look at a document as a practice. This is a document that we actually worked on last class, which was our in-class paper that we were doing, in-class practice paper. Take a second to read this, and I want you to try to see if you can figure out what the main point is. So hopefully you've gone through and been able to figure out the main point. When you're doing an outline, you just need to jot down the main ideas. You do not need to write out your full summary yet. So if I was to do my outline for this document, it would just be something like this. The government is more efficient, and the courts are better. That's all I would write down, and then I would move on to the next document. That way, when I'm coming through and I'm writing my body paragraphs, when I'm starting to put together my thesis and figure out my argument into buckets and all that type of stuff, I would know where this document would best fit. When I actually was going to write this, which would be later in the paper, it would be in your body paragraphs, not your first paragraph. It'd be after your thesis. I would write something like this. This would count as a document summary. So document H is an editorial from the Republic. That's my introduction, just introducing the document. It states that the government is more efficient and the federal courts are stronger due to new appointments. That's all you need. You need the main idea of the document, and that is it to get credit for a document summary. So now we're going to move to talking about document analysis. Analysis is something that you guys struggle with a little bit more, but the main goal of the analysis, and this is what you should be thinking through the entire paper when you're doing the analysis, is just prove your point. Prove the point that lines up with the prompt. If the prompt is asking you to explain the causes of World War I, this is the part where you explain the causes of World War I. If the prompt is asking you to explain how the government changed under FDR, this is the time to do that. Now you're going to want to outline that as well when you're going through your document. You're not going to want to go through it 2 separate times. So you would have written down your outline for your summary, and then right below that, you might write down just what your outline would be for your argument. So the first thing I noticed is that this is a positive review. The second thing I noticed is maybe I could link this to the court packing plan. Since it's talking about the Supreme Court, maybe I could go a little bit in detail of that. That could either potentially be a hap, or I could just use that as my analysis. That's another thing about analysis that you're really going to want to think about. You're going to want to use everything at your disposal. One of the biggest things I notice a lot of times when I'm grading analysis is that people aren't using everything to your disposal. You don't just have to use the documents to be able to make an argument. You can use anything that you know about the time period, about information that's related in the document. You can expand upon that information. It's not necessarily outside information because you're using it to support the document itself. it's not necessarily a hap unless you really go down that road. And sometimes you might get credit for haps when you weren't trying to do a hap, but haps are still a form of analysis. And also, sometimes you just need to use logic or critical thinking to be able to prove a document's point. So analysis can sometimes just be 1 to 2 sentences. Other times it can be almost a full paragraph. It just depends on how detailed you want to get in the analysis. For this document, if I was to explain the analysis, it would look something like this. Now, this is very, very long, and I'm not necessarily expecting you to do this for all of your documents. Additionally, sometimes you're going to be arguing multiple documents together, and that also helps explain analysis. But in doing this in isolation, I would say clearly document H believes that these changes are a positive for the country. That's my positive review part. While the document does state that the government is getting bigger with new departments, similar to other documents, it believes these departments are not bloat, but making the government more organized. Prior to the New Deal, the government was seen as acting slow, with complaints about Hoover's ineffectiveness leading to homeless shelters being called Hoovervilles, and some were critical of the Supreme Court ruling some New Deal programs unconstitutional, which had Roosevelt call for change with his court packing plan. While Roosevelt did not get what he wanted, it did cause a change in the court, and the document calls that a positive change to the country. See how I expanded upon the document and used basically everything I had at my approval now, at my disposal. I threw everything I had at the document. Now you see the prior to the New Deal, the government was seen as acting slow. Is that a hap? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It depends on how you want to think of it. I like arguing with historical situation because obviously I know a lot of historical situations. And if I get credit for the hap, awesome. If I don't get credit for the hap, that's okay. I'm going to make sure I put more than enough haps in my document or in my paper to get the full credit for the hap. All right, so I want you to practice. I want you to read this document. I want you to write out the summary, the intro, and I want you to try to do the analysis for it. I'm going to give you my answer in a couple seconds, but I want you to try to do this on your own. So pause this video and try to do a practice document. So the first thing I do is I want to outline my summary. The summary, again, is just the main idea. So black people are mattering in the country, although it's not perfect. That's what the document's basically saying. Then I want to think about how did this change the government. So that's my analysis outline. So black people did begin to vote Democrat, and I could also talk about maybe Eleanor Roosevelt as another reason for how black people began to vote. Is this outside information? Is this analysis? In certain ways, it's all the same. Basically, the thing I'm trying to do is prove my point. That's the main point of analysis, is to make sure I prove my point. So my intro and summary are at the top. This is an editorial from The Crisis. It states that black people are mattering more in the country, but it's not perfect. This highlights a change. And by the way, I would always start out my analysis by kind of reverberating the prompt. I'm explaining the change in the government. So I'm going to start out my analysis by stating this changes the government by. This highlights a change in politics when it comes to race relations in the country. Prior to the New Deal, black people were largely ignored or mistreated by the federal government, and FDR's administration did more to acknowledge black people. This effort was led more by Eleanor Roosevelt than FDR, and FDR did have large missteps with some of his New Deal programs discriminating against black people, such as the TVA not hiring black people. However, black people did ultimately see the good in the changes as black people began to vote away from the Republican Party and more towards the Democrats of FDR. All right. Now again, this is a lot of information. I'm not saying you need all of this information to get the analysis point, but this is me throwing everything I have at the document and at the, answering the question, which is ultimately what I'm wanting you to do. Your knowledge, your historical knowledge may not be quite as big as mine, but I still want you to throw everything you have at the document. All right, so now we're going to move to Haps, everyone's favorite. You have to have 3 Haps in your paper to get credit. You don't get credit for 1 or 2. So if you're not comfortable with Haps, I honestly would not really do them. I would focus more on analysis, and if you include some Haps in your analysis on accident, that's great. There are 2 things that you need for a Hap to be counted. The first thing you want to do is you need to be able to explain what the Hap is. So what is the historical situation? Who is the audience? Who is the point of view? Who is the purpose? Or what is the purpose? And the second thing that you need to do is you need to be able to argue why that's important. for the prompt itself. So we're going to look at two different documents. One is document I, one is document B. This one, the Roosevelt Record, the editorial on the crisis, and then the second is the letter to Robert Wagner. Take 1 second, try to figure out maybe how we would argue both of these things. Which would you use? What part of the Hap would you use? So for me, the Roosevelt Record, this was about black people that we just read about. I'm going to talk about 1940. Because I know the Fair Employment Act is coming in the next year, I'm going to tie that into the historical situation. For document B, since it's a letter to Robert Wagner, I'm going to outline that this is a letter to a senator. Now, you might have even put together that Robert Wagner and the Wagner Act are connected. That's like really, really impressive. So this would be my Hap for document I. With the document being written in 1940, the context is interesting because there were talks at this point about black people being excluded from defense industry jobs and a March on Washington protest. FDR responded to this by giving the Fair Employment Act, which stated that black people had to be included in the defense industry, showing another way that FDR's administration listened to black people. See how I'm adding to my argument? I'm not just stating this is from 1940 and the Fair Employment Act came out. I explained why that would be also showing a change in the government. The letter being written to a senator is important because senators have the power to change things through legislative power. It is likely that the author felt the senator had the power to stop socialism from taking over the country. Again, I'm not just saying that this is a letter from a senator, I'm expanding upon that. All right, for outside information should be argued similar to an ACE. It can't be in a document. Even if you're not using the document, it still can't be in another document. And it can't be something that you were using to support another document earlier, because that would be analysis. You also want to include it in your thesis. After you go through all the documents, it's a smart idea to think about what information do I know about this prompt that's not included in any of the documents, and use that as your outside information. For our in-class paper, I stated that unions, the Wagner Act, the government becoming more friendly and fair to workers would probably be the easiest thing. Even in my outline, I outlined this like an ACE. My answer is unions. My cite or example is the Wagner Act. And my explain is how that changed the government as the government becomes more friendly and fair to workers. If I wrote it out, I'd write it out like this. Another change that took place during the New Deal was that the government's relationship with workers. FDR passed the Wagner Act, which allowed for all workers to form unions and private companies. This caused for the power and size of unions to increase greatly and showed that the government was becoming more friendly towards workers. Previously, the government had been seen as anti-union by siding with businesses over workers in the Gilded Age, such as with the Pullman strike. Okay. Outside information is something I would definitely go for because all you're simply having to do is add an ACE to the paper. All right, now we get to the part where you would actually start to write. Everything else is kind of outlined first, and then you go back up and you start with your contextualization. Contextualization is explaining how we got to this point in society. How did we get to this point in society? You have to kind of have 4 different points or 4 different events that led up to this point in society. It's always smart to try to have your contextualization match with the theme of society, of what your prompt is. If it's about society, then you'd want your other points to be about society. So I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, World War I, and the 1920s. You need to have, again, 4 points. I want you just to pause this and you read this because I'm actually running out of time on my video software that I'm using, and you can read this on your own and see how I did the contextualization. The last thing is the thesis. The thesis is the answer to the prompt. It needs to go at the end of your first paragraph. You have your contextualization in your first paragraph, and then you put the thesis right there. Then you have all the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs would be from the outline that you've already made. So your thesis would be at the end, right here. It's the answer to the prompt, and it should include your reasoning as well. Finally, this is how you are going to be graded. All right. It is designed for you to be able to make pretty easily somewhere between a 60 and an 80, and it's very difficult to make higher than an 80. That is part 3 of the study guide.